Thank you all for jumping on the call. We're going to go ahead and get started. First, I want to welcome everyone on the call today. We've got teams watching from California, Washington, Michigan, and possibly even Brazil. So welcome all of you. Thank you for taking time out of your day to join us. And I hope that you really enjoy this introduction into a new way of looking at safety. This session is being recorded for those who could not attend today, and there will be time for questions at the end, or you can post them in the chat. So I'm really excited today to have the privilege of introducing our presenter, Dr. Todd Conklin. He has spent 25 years at Los Alamos National Laboratory as a senior advisor for organizational and safety culture. Los Alamos National Laboratory is one of the world's foremost research and development laboratories. Dr. Conklin has been working on the Human Performance Program for the last 15 years of his 25-year career. It is in this fortunate position where he enjoys the best of both the academic world and the world of safety in practice. He holds a PhD in organizational behavior from the University of Mexico. He speaks all over the world to executives, groups, and work teams who are interested in better understanding the relationship between workers in the field and the organization's systems, processes, and programs. He has brought these systems to major corporations around the world. He practices these ideas not only in his own workplace, but also in the event investigations at other workplaces around the world. His book, Pre-Accident Investigations, An Introduction to Organizational Safety, is a best-selling book on safety. He also has several other books and a huge podcast following for his twice-weekly podcast of the same name. He defines safety in his workplace as safety is the ability for workers to be able to do work in a varying and unpredictable world. Dr. Conklin lives in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and thinks that human performance is the most meaningful work he has ever had the opportunity to live and teach. And I have to say, I have read 4 of his books and attended his 3-day training session, and it was the best professional training that I have attended in my career. So I hope you all enjoy this time. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Conklin.
Holy cow, no pressure. What do you mean? You need to take more training if that was the best training. Hey, you guys, it's good to be with you. The only thing you missed in my bio is that I'm a 3-time finalist for the Publishers Clearinghouse giveaway. But I got a note that said I'm a finalist again. So this could be my lucky year. And if that's the case, I'm dumping the safety stuff and just jumping into a lap of luxury. I am so excited to get to spend time with you guys because you're right in the position that I think is maybe my favorite position for an organization. And so this discussion we're going to have today, it's going to be kind of quick, and we're going to try to dump as much stuff as we can into a little bag. So I'll be jamming a lot of information in your direction. But you guys are in a really interesting position where you have a long history of really conscientious work around safety. And so today I'm not going to talk a lot about safety because I'm not sure that's the conversation you guys need to have. Today I'm going to talk a lot about being safer. And it's the idea of what do you do with a foundation that's been built over years, that's got a lot of investment and a lot of care and concern and ownership. How do you take that program and move it to the next step? And it really is kind of this evolving nature of how safety changes, because we've just been through a remarkable set of circumstances the last couple of years. You know, the global toilet paper shortage. I mean, you lived through all this. I don't need to remind you of all the things that are going on in the world. And one of the most amazing things about that is this notion of uncertainty. And the one thing we know about uncertainty is that uncertainty is not manageable. We don't manage the presence of uncertainty because it's uncertain. That's not the smartest thing I've ever said. I've probably said smarter things than that. That seemed really obvious when I heard it out loud. What we manage is the ability to have uncertainty. And this idea becomes an important idea because one of the things I want to present to you is that I want to introduce a sort of a new definition for safety. And what I want to tell you is that safety is not the absence of an injury. That actually is probably kind of an old school way to look at safety. Safety is actually the presence of capacity. It's the presence of the ability to do work in critical environments in the midst of uncertainty, which sounds a little eggheady. So let me give you a sidebar story that makes me think about it this way. So a couple days ago, I was doing a big meeting a global safety leadership meeting, and it was a Teams meeting just like this. And I think I look good on Teams, although I should tell you guys before we go much further that the camera adds 100 pounds. So imagine that I'm actually 100 pounds smaller, and then you'll perfectly know who I am, right? And the meeting went really well. It was great. All these kind of highfalutin safety people on the call. And at the end, one person said, I look forward to a time where we've worked our way out of business. And I understood that completely. I mean, that's a noble thing to say. That's like saying, if we do our job right, we'll take care of this safety problem. We'll get it all dialed in and tweaked, and it'll be perfect, and we won't have to worry about this anymore. And I thought, well, that's a pretty good ending to the meeting. I'll be happy with that, because I was just kind of glad the meeting was over. But the host of the meeting then took kind of a wild turn and said, Todd, would you like to comment on what that person just said? And I mean, I couldn't really say no, because that would have been awkward. Although the answer was no, I didn't really want to comment on it. So I sort of had to. So I said, well, that concerns me a little. And here's why. I understand why you said it, and I think it's a noble thing to say, but that sort of defines safety as taking bad things out of a system. Safety removes harm. And I said, I'm not sure that's the goal of safety, at least from an operations standpoint. I actually think safety should assure success. Safety should actually make work go better. And if that's the case, I don't think we want to work our way out of business. I think we want to get more and more expertise and more people that are in the field with the workforce, assuring that success happens. And it was really interesting. And I felt sort of bad, you guys, because I added like a half hour extra to the meeting because it got into this really great discussion. But that's one of the premises I want to share with you, is that I think one of the things that we get to challenge ourselves on today is the fact that safety really isn't this absence of failure, because failure in operations is relatively normal. It happens all the time. And in fact, I'm going to say something that's a bit important for you to hear, and that is events take place all the time. The good news is that most of the events are detected early and corrected immediately before they have significant consequence. And so ultimately, part of today's goal for our little discussion is to actually leave you with more questions than when you came in. Now, that's a pretty low bar, but I feel safe with it. I mean, I feel really good about it, because I want to challenge you to think about what you've done in the past and to actually think about how we can build a bridge from a solid background in behavioral-based safety and a solid background in understanding worker and worker failure and at-risk behaviors to moving that forward so it has a much more systems approach, where we really look at the overall organization and the place where the worker meets the work. That's going to be really important. And to do that, I think the very best way to sort of kick this off is to start with a tiny little case study. So to get into this case study, I should give you a little bit of background. So you heard I work at Los Alamos National Laboratory. It's a really interesting place. It's this giant laboratory. It's in New Mexico. Not Mexico, New Mexico, one of the 50 states, just in case you forgot about us. And it's got we've got about 16,000 employees, most all of them pretty high level, highly educated. It's a big research and development facility. So like everybody has a PhD, like the guy who dumps the trash has a PhD. Everybody has a PhD. And I work in an office called the Safety and Health Initiative Office. And that's a really interesting place to kind of hang out. And we do lots of investigations for sure, but we work a lot with critical operations. So with quality, environment, safety, all those kind of things. And we look at sort of critical operations and how they function. And it's a really interesting place to be. So I'm a psychologist, an organizational psychologist by education. And so I get a lot of time to talk to people who do this critical work and to understand how we can make it go better, just like we talked about earlier. And I figured out about, it probably would have been 15 years ago or so, that December is the best month to work at Los Alamos National Laboratory. It is the perfect month. And so I started to think about that. And I should tell you why December is such a good month. It's a great month because it's the month where everybody looks really busy, but nobody's doing very much work. So that's kind of a good month because we give the week between Christmas and New Year's off. So the whole place closes down. The week before the holidays is all parties. That's my favorite week of the whole year. And the week before that is the week preparing for the parties that happen the week before that. So December is this incredibly interesting time. It's really, really a fun time to be there. But it's not the reason entirely that it's my favorite month. The reason it's my favorite month is because it's the month where when you go to a meeting, people bring special treats. So like you could go to a meeting and there'd be cake and cookies and candy and fudge. And I don't know how you guys determine what a good meeting is from a bad meeting, but I figure a meeting that's got homemade cake, homemade cookies, candy, and fudge, that qualifies as a good meeting. And if they restock the room, I'd probably never leave the meeting. That's how much I love it. And so I made this decision about 15 years ago that I would simply not travel in December. And what's amazing about that is if you say that convincingly enough, when people call you and ask you to travel in December, and you say, I'm sorry, I don't travel in December. It's a busy month and we have a lot of important meetings. People just kind of fall for it and it works beautifully. I mean, it's the best thing I probably ever did at work because it gave me the month of December to enjoy the laboratory. And that worked beautifully until about probably 7 years ago. And I'm sitting in my office on like the 4th of December and my phone rings and I pick it up and this voice on the other end of the phone says to me, Dr. Conklin, we've had an accident. Can you help us? So if you're a safety person, and there's a bunch of us in the workshop today, if you get a call like that, there's only one answer. The only answer you can ever say to that is anything you need, I'm here for you. So that's what I said. Anything I can do for you, I'm here for you. The person on the other end of the phone says, what my boss would like is, could you come and be a part of the investigation team? And I said, maybe. I mean, that's a little unusual. When would you like me to come? And the guy said, can you be here tomorrow? Which would be like the 5th of December. So I said, just as I've rehearsed many times before, I'd love to. That sounds really important, but unfortunately, December's a busy month and we have a lot of really important meetings. And normally people fall for that, but in this case, the guy didn't fall for it at all. In fact, he kind of notched up the pressure and he was not taking no for an answer. And I was trying every way possible to say no. I was using all my inner Canadian skills to politely say no, but it just wasn't working. And finally, it got a little weird, almost borderline creepy. And I thought, well, I don't really know what happened, so I'll ask him what happened. So I said to the guy, are there fatalities? Are there serious injuries? And the man on the other end of the phone said, no fatalities, no injuries. This is a property damage event. Well, so for those of you guys who aren't safety people, I should tell you this. There's not a property damage event in the world that can't wait until January. And nobody brings Christmas candy to a meeting in January. In fact, if you bring Christmas candy to a meeting in January, people are going to ask you how old that candy is. And I don't want to live in a world where they question candy. That's not my place, right? So now that I know nobody's hurt, nobody's injured, my guilt's been greatly lifted. So we finally get to a point where I sort of hang up and I get off the call. And I think, shoo, that was a close one. I mean, I was one banana peel away from leaving during my favorite month. 2 minutes later, this is totally a true story. 2 minutes later, the guy calls back and he said, I forgot to tell you something really important. And I said, well, what'd you forget to tell me? And the guy said, the accident happened in our offshore operations in Thailand. It happened on the beach in a temporary loading platform. The closest hotel is a really nice resort. And my boss said he would be fine if you want to bring your friends or family with you. I paused an appropriate amount of time and then I said, I've just had some meetings cancel. I'm pretty sure I can work you in. You guys, I would have started with the free trip to Thailand and then worked my way back to the dumb investigation. That's how I would have done it. But nonetheless, this is the case that I want you to sort of kick off our thought experiment today with. This is the Thailand event. Now, when it's done, I'm going to ask a question, and we're saving questions to the end. So think of this question as sort of a mental exercise, because the question I'm going to ask is relatively significant to what we're going to talk about today. So without any further ado, Dr. J, with your giant bandwidth, can you show the Thailand case study?
Takes place in a temporary loading platform for offshore support for natural gas wells in the Gulf of Thailand. And it was very temporary. It was set up on the beach and they dredged the beach so it was deep and steep, and they could bring vessels in alongside where they had a construction crane on some concrete pads. And they would load 3 vessels a day, pretty much 6 days a week. And they loaded every single load on every single vessel with something they call super sacks, big bags, 1-ton cloth bags. Now, these 1-ton cloth bags are normally used for bulk items, granulated items like sand or dirt. But in this case, these guys would load everything into these big bags, these super sacks, and then they would rig those super sacks onto the crane hook. Boxes of equipment, maintenance items, food, probably people, but they said they never put people in there. Every single load, 3 loads a day, 6 days a week, was loaded into super sacks. The super sacks were rigged to the crane, and then they were taken through an exclusion area to the vessel to be unloaded on board the boat. If you load 3 loads a day, 6 days a week for 8 years, and everything's in super sack, what you are is the world's best expert in loading super sacks. But what you don't know how to do is load anything that wouldn't fit into a super sack. And that's where this story takes a turn. Because for the event, this crew was asked to load an inline gas separation unit. It's basically a piece of equipment that's in a piece of pipe. It's long, skinny, and heavy. If you look up in the dictionary, things that won't fit in a bag, the definition starts with long, skinny, and heavy. And so these workers were faced with a condition that was off normal and they had not faced before. They had to solve the problem. And so what they did was adapt. So instead of using the super sack like a bag, they decided that they could use that same super sack like a sling. So they found the middle of the piece of pipe, and the way they found the middle, by calculating halfway the center of gravity, so the center of the piece of pipe. And then they wrapped the bag once around, and then a second time around, so the handles of the super sack were pointed forward, and they hooked those handles up to a crane. Then they took a piece of rope and tied some very tight knots to keep the bag as secure as possible. They lifted the bag with the crane, and they started to move the load towards the boat. Now, the crane never moves because it's on a concrete platform on the beach. And the biggest hazard these workers have is suspended overhead load. Never want a person underneath a suspended overhead load. And because the crane never moves, the load always flies in the same place. And so what the guys did is they figured out long ago where the danger zone was. And in that danger zone, they put some small fences and some red X's on the beach. This kept people from beneath the suspended load while they loaded the crane. So they lift this pipe up, and it's very curiously balanced, and they start to swing the load towards the vessel. And what do you think happens next? You're right. It has to fall, because if it doesn't fall, this is the dumbest story on earth. And it does. And it falls hard. And it hits the beach, and it breaks this piece of equipment into a lot of small pieces. Now, this will fit in a bag. But when it falls exactly where they predicted it would fall. It lands inside that exclusion zone. Operations halted because they broke a very important piece of equipment. But when it fell exactly where they predicted it would fall in case it fell. Nobody got hurt, but operations ceased. Here's my question for you. Is this a success or a failure?
Success or failure? It seems on the surface kind of like a goofy question. And I mean that in the most respectful way you can say goofy question. But in fact, I actually think this choice of how an organization responds is a fundamentally important part of how we have this discussion around human performance. because how the organization reacts to an event colors how the organization moves forward from that event. Let me say that again, because that's really important. How the organization reacts to an event colors how the organization moves forward from that event. That's true of raising kids or raising puppies or working with a club or managing a team or being a CEO of a giant organization. How you respond matters. And that's a fundamental important part of what we want to talk about. Because you can look at this event all you want to, and that event brings with it lots of information. In fact, right now, you're sitting there on the cusp of this question, thinking about this as either a success or a failure. And those are okay choices. Like if you're really into operations, the fact that operations ceased, they halted completely, and they could not do any work, really makes this event the beginning of a relatively significant operational upset. This is a failure. But if you're interested in safety, the fact that they predicted where this load would drop, they built barriers and controls around the place where they thought the load would land, and then when the load failed, it failed exactly the way they thought it would, and it failed in such a way that nobody was injured. Well, I mean, no matter how you push it, from a safety standpoint, that's probably a success. And what's interesting is I knew almost immediately how this organization had responded. Because when I got off the plane to start the investigation, the crew of people that actually did this work were no longer working for the organization. They'd let them go. Or I believe the word they use is they'd run them off, right? But they'd gotten rid of them. And they'd gotten rid of them because they'd lost faith in their ability to reliably do work. And the reason they'd lost that faith in their ability to reliably do work is because they felt the work didn't happen the way they thought it should happen. And so we started the investigation, but I'll tell you, it's kind of hard to do an investigation when the people who had the failure aren't there. I mean, that makes it sort of difficult. But we carefully tried to reconstruct as much as we possibly could and did probably an okay job. And then it came time to have the meeting. Now, I don't know if you've had to go to the meeting, but every event like that has a meeting, and that is where the big boss gets together and they sit at one end of the table and they bring everybody else in and they talk about the event. And it's kind of a critique, maybe. It's a way to sort of have a discussion around what on earth just happened. And so I went to the big meeting and sat in my little chair and was paying attention and looking observant. And the big boss, the country chairperson, the president of the business, got up at the end of the table and he said, these workers made a series of bad choices. And because they made a series of bad choices, they dropped a relatively significant load, which upset and stopped operations. Our decision was to actually remove these workers from the workplace and to actually replace them with workers that will make better choices. And then he looked at me because I guess it was my time to talk. I don't know why I was surprised by that. They flew me from the United States to Thailand. I should have known I'd probably have to say something. So he looked at me and I looked back at him and I thought, well, I'll just start this way. So I looked at him and I said, can I ask a question before we get started in this discussion? And he said, sure. And I said, what day of the week did this failure happen? And he looked at me and he said, it happened on a Wednesday. So I said, on Wednesday, these guys were marched off the site and removed from employment pretty ceremoniously. It's a pretty significant deal. I said, that happened on Wednesday. And he said, yes, it's a little better than that, but that's what happened. And I said, who ran that operation on the Tuesday before that Wednesday? And he looked at me and he said, well, those guys did. I said, so on Tuesday, they were trusted, respected, effective workers who loaded 3 vessels on time, within schedule, and on scope. And on Wednesday, they were marched off the site as if they were criminals. And he looked at me, and this could have gone really bad, you guys. It didn't, thank goodness for me, but it didn't. And he looked at me, and I said, what changed between Tuesday and Wednesday? And he said, I don't know that answer. And I said, well, I think that's actually the answer we have to solve. That's the one we have to actually tackle. And he said, well, how do you propose doing that? And that discussion from then on took a really interesting turn because we moved from this notion of determining accountability and placing blame to actually reconstructing the conditions present in order to have a failure like they had. And to do that, they had to bring those guys back. And that was a big deal, but they did it. And in bringing those guys back, we were able to ask them questions. How on earth did we get into a position where this kind of consequence could be possible? And what those workers did was slowly but surely explain that event. That idea that we can actually understand how work happens by talking to the people who actually do the work is also a really important part of how we think about human performance. And the investigation from then on went really well, and we learned so much. In fact, we not only learned so much, but their operations improved, not just in the Gulf of Thailand, but globally, because they were able to understand some intricacies of moving equipment that they'd simply just not talked about, trained for, or qualified to before that point in time. And as you can imagine, I drug this investigation out as long as I possibly could, because why not? It was a really nice resort. They had 2 different dinner buffets every night, and if you changed hats, you could have dinner twice. It was the perfect way. It was the best place to eat dinner twice in the world. But eventually they came to me and they said, you got to go. You're done. And I said, well, I got a couple more days. And they said, no, we think you're done. And they flew me back. And it was weird. On the flight back, I'm sitting on the plane, in my luxurious coach seat, aisle seat, exit row. So that is pretty good. And the lady next to me reads a newspaper. Now, this is probably, I would guess this is 8 or 9 years ago. And so she was going to read a real newspaper, not some iPad-y newspaper. I mean, this was a real sheet of paper. And I don't know if you know this, but if the middle seat person decides they're going to read the newspaper, they've committed everybody else in that row to that activity. Whether you want to or not, we are going to read the newspaper. So she opens up the newspaper, and right in front of my face, just right in front of my eyes, is a headline. Now, remember, this is 9 years ago. And the headline says, Volvo, the car company, will make a fatality-free car. So I'm looking at that thinking, whoa, that is quite a statement. And I don't know what you're thinking, because I'd be curious to know, but that's pretty bold. Like, could you say about your facility now that you can guarantee it'll be fatality free? I mean, that'd be a really bold statement. But that's sure enough what Volvo did. And so I'm looking at that article and I'm thinking, wow, this is pretty compelling. Now, I don't know what you would do if you read that headline, but I'll tell you what I wanted to do, because I'm a genius. Just get ready. Read the rest of the article. So I turned to the lady next to me and I said, when you're done with that paper, can I read it? And the lady looked at me and she said, it's right in front of your face. Knock yourself out. You can read it now. And I said, well, quit wiggling it around. And I will. And she takes that article. She takes the page the article's on and she folds it. She hands it to me. She says, I'm not going to read it. So it's yours. It's a gift. And it's amazing because the first line of that article talks about the fact that there are 5 different car models, 5, that are sold globally that are fatality-free more than 15 years. And what's amazing is if you get a chance, look this up. I mean, this is completely worth Googling because it's incredibly interesting. And the question I'd ask you, sitting there looking pretty, is how's that happen? How can they make a fatality-free car? How can they make the claim that the car is fatality-free? But let's not actually ask that question. Let's ask a different one. Let's take this back to kind of first principles. So let me ask you this. In your opinion, what's the most important safety feature in a car? I'll give you some time to think about it. Now, normally, if we were in a classroom together, I would ask you this and kind of wait on and sort of browbeat you into answering. But because there's a lot of us in this workshop, let me answer it this way. I would guess when I asked the question, what's the most important safety feature in a car, that a bunch of you just said the word driver, which is really good. A bunch of you said seatbelts. A bunch of you said airbags, frame, brakes. Some of you said horn, and I'm glad you said that because that actually speaks for the unspoken horn users in the world. And really, the list could go on for a long, long time. But let's actually talk about why that question is important, and let's talk about it as it relates to this idea of human performance. So let me actually build the case for you why we're having this discussion. What do you think a seatbelt's job? Let's start with seatbelts and then move to driver. Sound good? Okay, good. I'm glad you agree. What do you guys think is a seatbelt's primary safety function in a car? Okay, you're right. It holds you in. It restrains you is the word they use. It's restraint. And it's actually incredibly effective. In fact, if you look at all the controls that are available in vehicle safety, The lowest cost control has probably the highest impact. So seatbelts cost virtually nothing by this point in the game. I mean, they really do. They cost pennies, and yet they provide dramatic amount of protection. But how shocked are you going to be if I tell you that the seatbelt doesn't actually just simply restrain? It doesn't just simply hold you in the car. That actually what the seatbelt does is position you. In fact, the seat and the seatbelt are called occupant positioning systems. And the car manufacturing people, I spend a lot of time with them, they talk about this in glowing terms. What the seatbelt does is ensures the engineers who design the vehicle that the people, that's the most important thing in the vehicle, are where the engineers think they're going to be, so they can actually build systems to provide the best, most effective protection for the soft tissue, that's what they call us, that's in the vehicle. Now, this is a huge shift in the way we think about vehicle safety. And it's really based upon this idea. About 60 years ago, actually probably a little longer than 60 years ago, the automotive industry got together and they said, holy guacamole, asking drivers to not crash is really the right thing to say, but it's not terribly effective. Instead of asking drivers not to wreck, why don't we actually change the way we think about safety? And here's what they said, and this is bold, so I hope you're sitting down, because what I'm about to say is really controversial. So are you ready? They said, not every accident is preventable. And because not every accident is preventable, let's not manage the absence or presence of the accident. Let's just assume the accident's going to happen, and let's manage the car's capacity to have the accident safely. Now, the reason that's controversial is because your entire career, you've been told at almost every safety meeting you go to that every accident is preventable. And I get that. I mean, I understand completely why they say that to you. Every accident is preventable. And here's what I'm going to tell you. That's always true in retrospect. It's the same with lottery numbers. Every winning lottery number is knowable after it's been selected. The problem is before they select the winning lottery number, it's a lottery number. And it's really difficult to predict. And that's kind of the same thing with accidents. And this is a bold statement. And what we're doing is we're moving the organization from a bias towards preventing all bad things from happening, which isn't a bad bias at all, to actually a much more mature understanding operationally of creating systems that have the ability to fail safely. And one of the interesting things about the video that we watched of the Gulf of Thailand is that ultimately what you're looking at is a system that had the ability to fail safely. Now, what's remarkable about that is when they started talking about this in vehicles, vehicle safety got better, way better. But it meant a fundamental shift in the way we define safety. And that fundamental shift in the way we define safety, well, that's really why we're going to have the conversation today, is because the automotive industry changed the way we thought about safety. For years, we've managed safety by preventing bad things from happening. But what the automotive industry said was what we ought to do is ensure good things happen. And it really goes to things like what we measure. We measure safety by counting the number of people you hurt. When you say that out loud, it seems a little ridiculous, kind of stupid sounding, because that's a dumb way to measure how safe you are. That's a really good way to measure how not safe you are, but it's a crappy way to measure how safe you are. We shouldn't measure things we don't want. And what the automotive industry said is, let's measure things we do want. Let's put enough systems in the car so that we can actually make a change in the outcome of an event that will happen. And so cars are designed around this idea. Every time you drive, there's 100% chance you're going to wreck it. You won't, but there's 100% chance. And the car's designed around that idea of 100% crashing. And they don't actually manage the absence or presence of the failure, because failure is really interesting. Failure is not abnormal. In fact, failure happens all the time. Events are happening even as we speak in this workshop. The difference is that failure that actually has capacity to fail without consequence is not really failure. And I've said it before, and I'm sure I'll say it again. Failure operationally is not the opposite of success, right? Failure is a really important part of becoming successful. What we do for a living is go out into the world, do highly critical work in a complex environment, fail, learn from it, become better, and go out and fail better than we did the next time. That idea is what we want to capture on your journey to understanding human performance. But to get there, what we have to do is redefine safety. Safety for us is not the absence of accidents. Safety for us is probably much better defined as the presence of capacity. We don't get better by removing bad things from our operations. We actually get better by putting good things in our operations. And as simple as this sounds, this is a very, very, very different way to understand safety. This is not the way your traditional safety definition has been managed in your organization. And folks, this shift is vital. In fact, if you don't make this jump, you will be stuck in a past, in a world that actually is requiring more and more resilience. And we know that because of the idea of uncertainty. We started talking about uncertainty. You don't get to manage an uncertain future because plans can't plan for unexpected events. If they could, we'd plan for them, I promise. So if you can't manage an uncertain future, then what you can manage is the ability to have an uncertain future. And that takes us right back to where we started. Start the job when you're sure. Start the job when the controls are in place. But where's this take us? Well, I think I actually owe you one really important slide. So let me show it. It's just right over my shoulder. I don't think you'll have any problems with this. It's an easy slide. This is your folks' journey in safety. And if you see, we've got a chart there, and it has accidents over time. And if I were to draw a line of your safety performance in the last, 20 years, this is more like 10 years, but we'll say 20 because it sounds better. That's what your line looks like. And what's amazing to me is this is not the line of a loser organization. Oh no, if I may, let me speak a little French. En contraire, this is actually a story of steady progression and safety maturity. And you know this because you live in your organization and you actually have seen your organization change. Even if you've only been here a couple of weeks, that change is pretty palpable. You can see it. And what happens is we've gotten better and better and better at being safe. And that's really the challenge I bring to you guys in this discussion is what do you do with an organization that's pretty good at being safe? Like you guys are pretty good at being safe, but how do I take you to the next level, which is how does the organization become safer? And that I think is probably captured in this slide. So this is your journey, and you'll see that one of the problems with this is as event numbers get lower, it starts to flatten out. We'll talk about that, but that's going to be the big payoff here in this discussion. Here's where it starts. It starts with compliance. And so compliance is really an important part of our discussion because compliance is where the safety improvement really started to take hold in your organization. And so believe it or not, there was a period of time, and depending on how old you are, and I'm not saying you're old, don't get me wrong, but depending on how old you are, it's actually a relatively recent story where compliance was pretty new. OSHA, in the scheme of things, was started in the mid-70s. So, I mean, even that doesn't feel that old if you think about it. But compliance is really interesting because what compliance said is this is how we believe this work should be done. So this is the standard by which we'll perform the job. And one of the things we know is that this standard actually is a way that does this work safely. So therefore, you should do work this way. And in order to ensure you do work this way, we're going to actually make a rule or a regulation or a process or a procedure or some kind of compliance related instrument. And we're going to hold you accountable to being obedient to this compliance. And what's amazing, if you look at the line, is it worked beautifully. I mean, it made a huge difference almost immediately. Here's the right way to do the job. Do it that way. Wear this equipment. And if you do these things, you'll have fewer injuries. And that's exactly what happened. Until it starts to level out. And you can see on that chart that there's definitely a midpoint there where that line levels out. Now, why does that happen? Well, there's a couple things we should talk about with compliance. Nothing's wrong with compliance. In fact, it's the foundation upon which your program has been built, whether it's quality, safety, operations, production, whatever you do, compliance is really important. However, compliance is difficult in sustaining long-term improvement. So compliance makes a really, really strong first impression, but then it sort of loses some of its mojo, if I can use technical safety terms like mojo. But it's true. And the reason is, actually, the three reasons are like this. The first problem with compliance is that more rules don't create more safety. So this is kind of tough because we sort of want more rules to amplify more safety. So one rule that says don't cut your hand is great. 12 rules that say don't cut your hand must be 12 times safer, but it's not. That's just not how it works. One rule that says don't use your cell phone and drive, I could get behind that. That's a good rule. 4 rules that say don't use your cell phone and drive is not 4 times better. It's still the same rule repeated 4 times. And so part of what happens is we start to understand that compliance is a really good initial lever to change, but it's not a sustainable lever to change, which takes me to the second part of compliance that I think is worth pointing out to you guys today. And that is compliance is always directed at the individual worker. So we fix workers one worker at a time. That's how we do compliance. And as organizations get larger and more complex and more geographically spread out, the scope of geography, I made that up, but it sounds good, doesn't it? Gets larger, it becomes more and more difficult to manage workers one worker at a time. And so we lean on things like behavioral-based safety programs, which still are focused on one worker. And we create these peer assessments where now peers are watching each other, and we can sort of write how effective that'll be over time, because that actually has some erosive qualities that are worth talking about. The third part of compliance, I've already sort of talked about, but it's worth noting, and that's the idea that compliance really has a difficult time with variation. So compliance assumes there's one right way to do a job, but the world in which you do work doesn't agree with that assumption. So weather changes and people changes and conditions change and customers change and clients change, and you could make a list as long as you want to make it. And what workers really do is not manage to the procedure, they manage to the variation around that procedure. And that becomes a really important part of how we think about change as well. So that takes us to the second level. And the second level is really safety by design. A lot of organizations call it process safety. In fact, my organization calls it process safety. And that is, we figured out at some point after compliance started leveling out that we could actually look at the systems in which work gets done, and we could design safety into those systems, and it would be really effective. And it was. Look at the drop. I mean, it got better almost immediately. When we figured out you can design control rooms so that they're uniform, or control apparatus so they're uniform. You can make forklifts all work the same. You can design guards and handrails. And I mean, this list could go on for a long time. Your car is a big design safety experiment. And what's amazing is that when we started designing safety into the system, we got better. We got way better. The problem is that it's expensive and time consuming, and not everything needs to be designed. And so design safety also starts to level out after a while. And that's where we are now, that flat line. And what's interesting about this flat line, if you remember from your college algebra class or even high school algebra class, you probably talked about it then. If you remember a phrase, it's kind of a great word in mathematics. I like it because it sounds dirty, but it's not. I mean, you can use it anywhere, but it sounds really, really dirty. A curve that goes dramatically down like that and then plateaus out, it levels out, never gets to zero. That's actually called an asymptotic curve. It's an asymptote. And an asymptote tells you that your process, no matter what your process is, it's a process mathematics tool. Whatever process you're doing, the strategy you're using to manage that process is no longer impactful. And so anytime you see an asymptotic curve like this, and that's where you guys are on your journey, what it tells you is that the current methods you're using to manage safety are no longer effective to take you to the next level of improvement. In fact, let me phrase it differently. Doing the same things harder or doing more of the same things is not getting you the next level of benefit. And that's right where we started when we started looking a long time ago at this idea of human and organizational performance. My boss came to me and said, we're in this asymptotic curve. We got to bust this asymptote. Help us do it. So we put together a team of people and we traveled all around the world and we looked for organizations that were good at managing reliable performance. And here's what we learned. Compliance focuses on the people. Design focuses on the system. Our next level of improvement is probably understanding the interface, the complex coupling between people and systems. And that's where human and organizational performance starts to grow some wings. Because when we started looking at the place where the work meets the worker, what we found was a remarkable change. A remarkable change. It gave us new things to understand, new things to learn. And because we had new things to learn, there were new things that we could make better. And the improvement didn't just impact safety. What we noticed almost immediately is that it impacted operations at every single level. The intricacies and complexities that workers manage in real time, the place where they meet our systems, those are filled with lots of opportunities to improve. And it works. And that's where you are on this journey. But we're not done. The only reason I agreed to sit here and talk to you through a computer today, because this is not that fun. I don't know if you guys know this, but it gets a little tedious after. It feels like you're in a room talking to a closet. That's what it feels like. Is for what I'm going to say next. The reason I'm even here, the reason I care about this is this. Really safe organizations still have the potential for catastrophic failure. What worries me is that really safe organizations with really low reportable numbers, low injuries, low days away numbers, still kill people. And we had to figure that out. And what's amazing is that human performance allowed us to understand fatalities and serious events in a different way. And here's what we figured out. The things that kill workers are not the same things that injure workers. And so all the tracking we do dutifully to understand injuries, in the belief, I think, that we can somehow predict the future, the Heinrich pyramid, the safety pyramid, that's all not true. And human performance allowed us to have that discussion. We could never have it before. We could actually say there is no connection between frequency and severity. You can't draw a pyramid because when people die, they don't die because they had 21 ankle sprains. They die not because of a lack of prevention. They die because of a lack of control. And what's remarkable is that this is a real shift between traditional safety. And you know this. I mean, this isn't even a surprise. Traditional safety, you've been doing it for years, is described like this. The worker is the problem, and so we have to make the worker be more safe. So we fix safety by making workers better at being safe. We observe them, we tell them, we write procedures, we write practices, we write rules, we write regulations. We tell workers what to do, or more importantly, what not to do. And we define safety as the absence of accidents. Now, that is a classic prevention bias. That is going to take us around the trail that says we're going to prevent, every accident is preventable. But we learned that that was not enough. What we learned is that there's a different way to look at safety. That human and organizational performance says the worker's not the problem. The worker's actually the problem solver. You will not get better by making your workers be more safe. Asking them to care more and try harder feels like the right thing to do, but it doesn't equate into better operations. So if the worker is the problem solver, if the worker is the solution, then we don't tell workers what to do. Ready for this? We ask them what they need. And that little switch in dialogue, man, that thing is worth its weight in gold. But to get there, we have to fundamentally shift our thinking. Safety is not the absence of accidents. Safety for us is the presence of capacity. And just as the old view was biased on preventing bad things from happening, what the new view becomes interested in is assuring good things happen. You don't make a system better by taking out the bad parts. You make a system better by putting in the good parts. And to do that, we have to come right back to this definition. Safety is not the absence of accidents. Because if you do high-risk work and nothing bad happens, were you good or were you lucky? And how, pray tell, do you tell the difference between the two? Safety is much better understood by not seeing as the absence of failure, but by the presence of control, by the presence of safeguards, by the presence of barriers, by the presence of practices, by the presence of training, by the presence of experience, by the presence of capacity. This shift in thinking is vital. And this is really the most important message of our time together. If I can get you to do nothing else, if you'll revisit how you define success, this will change how you create the success. It's a powerful, powerful way to think about safety differently, but it means you have to shift the philosophy, shift the paradigm. And that's exactly what human performance is doing. It's not a new program. In fact, all the same safety things you've done for years will continue to be done. I wouldn't stop doing any of those things. Those are the ones that got you to where you are on that asymptotic curve. Going backwards and throwing them out is probably not a better idea. What changes is not what you guys do. What changes is what you folks think about. We're going to shift philosophically the way we define safety. Let's start with this idea. You're not going to fix safety by fixing safety. No. What you have to do is actually fix the operations in which work is being done in order to make work more reliable and resilient. And you're not going to get to that by asking people to be more reliable and resilient. You've got to build that into the system. And that's kind of a big part of what we want to talk about. So let me take you one step further. Remember, we're just in an introductory conversation, but I think I can describe what it's like to work. And you guys tell me if I'm wrong, because I'm wrong a lot, so I can handle it. But you folks do a lot of work, and you do a lot of high-risk critical work, a lot of important work. And I think if I had to describe it, I'd describe it like this. You're as safe as you need to be without being overly safe in order to be productive. Workers are as safe as they need to be without being overly safe in order to be productive. What do you think about what I just said? So, funny story maybe? I mean, I think it's funny. I don't know if you will or not. But I'm giving this workshop the other day, and I put this slide up, and this lady says to me, that slide's offensive. And I thought, wow, that slide offended you. Everything else I said, none of that triggered your offensive indicator, because I'm relatively offensive. I mean, the whole asymptote joke, pretty high risk, right? But she said, no, I find that slide really offensive. And I said, why? And she said, in my organization, you can never be too safe. My workers will never be too safe. And I didn't know what to say to her. I mean, what I wanted to say is, when's the last time you actually touched a tool? When's the last time you did actual work in the field with risk and hazard? But I didn't say that because that sounds like it'd be kind of snarky. So instead, I thought about it, and I thought, I'm going to ask her this question. Same question I'm going to ask you. So this question's coming to you. How do you know you're safe enough while you're driving? So I know what you're saying right now. I didn't crash, or I got there safely, right? Those are really good answers. However, that's not the answer to the question I asked. That's a different question. How do you know you're safe enough after you drove? Like if you get there safely, the driving part's over, right? How do you know you're safe enough while you're driving? And this is kind of a tough question. And the more I asked this lady that question, and I was kind of pushing her a little, we were on one of these meetings like this. She finally said, well, I follow the rules. I wear my seatbelt. My car's in good condition. I'm alert. I'm attentive. And I said, those are all great things. Do they ensure safety? And she said, no. She said, it's weird because the one thing I can't control is every other driver on the road. And I said, yeah, that's how that works. I mean, we all sort of enter into this sacred commitment that we promise to stay in our lane and everybody else promises to stay in their lane. And generally, it's a pretty stable system until it's not, right? And she looks at me and she says, well, I think the answer to your question is you don't know if you're safe enough. And I said, I'm actually super impressed with you right now, because that is a bold thing to say. Because I could change the word driving to working in a minute. I mean, just in a minute, right? How do you know you're safe enough while you're working? And you don't. And that actually leads me to one other important foundational shift in the way human performance asks you to think. And that is around this notion of risk. So you don't drive in one giant task. Actually, you drive in thousands of micro tasks. So you're constantly assessing risk and adjusting control. Assessing risk and adjusting control. That's how you drive. I mean, that's absolutely how you drive. And that actually brings me to a really interesting point. And that is that traditionally safety, the prevention bias safety that we've talked about for years, tried to believe it could manage risk. And I will grant you, any risk we can remove from a system, we should. Any risk we can manage, we ought to manage. But the problem with that is that assumes risk is permanent and stable. And in your world, and you know this better than anybody else I get to talk to, that's simply not true. You will never have a job that's not risky, no matter what you do. And the risk you deal with is constantly in motion. It's dynamic. It moves in and out. It ebbs and flows like the waves of the ocean. And so risk is pretty difficult to manage. And here's what I'm going to tell you. We had to figure out on this journey, and it was a big deal when we figured this out, is that risk isn't the part we manage. You don't manage risk because it's dynamic and it's in motion. What you manage is the ability to have risk. And so like driving, you assess risk and manage control. The one thing I can tell you about driving is you don't get to manage the behavior of the people around you. What you manage is your behavior in relationship to the people around you. And that's how we think about work. And it's totally changed work for us. Where once we would freak out on high risk critical work, like high voltage, right? Or arc events. So I can think of a million, but those are good ones for you guys to think about, right? And that used to scare the crap out of me because that's super risky, right? And yet it was actually quite stable. And what we realized is the reason that high risk operation was so stable is because the controls were mature, they were effective, they were understood, and people used them all the time. That changed everything. Where once I would have told you high risk was scary, now what I'll tell you is that I'm not certain I'm that scared of high voltage electricity, but I'm super scared of getting a pickup truck across the loading lot. Because the number of controls are great in critical work, but moving a fork truck, it's basically I see you, you see me. And so one of the things, if I could do anything for you, one of the things I would suggest that changes while you're on this journey is this notion that somehow you assess high-risk critical operations based upon the risk. You don't base it upon the risk. It's not the presence of risk. It's the absence of control. So high-risk work with good controls is not terribly risky. But high-risk work with no controls should scare the poop out of you. Sorry to use clinical terms like poop, but it's an important term to use. Ultimately, what's amazing to me is how accurate this slide is. Your workers are as safe as they need to be. And I can say that because if they need to be safer, you know what they do? They become safer. But nobody's going to be too safe because once you're safe, you don't need to be safer. And in fact, there's not a lot of reward for becoming overly safe. Nobody got the prize for being overly safe. And ultimately, we keep score in production. Your workers are safe as they need to be without being overly safe in order to be productive until they're not. And that's what we should talk about. So let me show you the second, and I think, near as I can tell, depends on how things go, the final case study. This is it. We've had them both. This is Kenny the alligator wrestler. And Kenny's going to actually stick his head in the alligator's mouth, and the alligator's going to bite his head. Now, it's not bloody, and he doesn't die, but it's incredibly graphic. So if this is too much for you to watch, and it may very well be too much for you to watch, you have my permission to turn your head and look away. I'm not worried because the people next to you are going to put stuff in chat, and you're going to get the whole story anyway. But without any further ado, ladies and gentlemen, this is Kenny, the Alligator Wrestling Show.
Miami, Florida. Tourists from all over the world come to the Miccosukee Indian Village for traditional foods, handmade crafts, and Kenny Cypress's Alligator Wrestling Show. Climbing into a pool of hungry alligators is a terrifying proposition, but not for Kenny. He's lived and worked with these dangerous reptiles all his life. Kenny begins his show by wrestling this 10-foot, 350-pound gator out of the water. Easier said than done. Kenny demonstrates that an alligator will normally keep its jaws open, unless you touch the inside of its mouth. All it takes is the slightest sensation. Even a grain of sand will trigger these powerful jaws to clamp shut. He invites the crowd to try it themselves.
Is anybody interested?
As always, there are no takers. Kenny continues with his usual routine, unaware that his good luck is about to run out. It's New Year's Day. Kenny attempts the grand finale that has thrilled thousands of people, putting his head inside the gator's mouth.
And the jaws are open, and the head is in.
The gator's jaws slam shut and lock Kenny in a vice-like death grip. Another trainer struggles to free him, but the gator won't let go. Shaking its head, the deadly reptile drives its razor-sharp teeth deeper into Kenny's skull.
Get the wood! Get the wood!
Other trainers rush in and try to open the gator's mouth. But a wooden stick is useless against the 3,000 pounds of pressure that's being exerted on Kenny's head. The gator has tasted blood, and he's not about to let go. Eventually, the trainers manage to pry open the gator's powerful jaws, giving Kenny a chance to escape. He pulls his head free and staggers away as the men subdue the angry beast. Kenny is rushed to the hospital, dazed and bleeding. Almost a year later, he is still not fully recovered from his injuries.
I had a hole straight through here, going inside my mouth. I had one tooth in my ear, the larger tooth inside my ear, so my hearing ain't that great on my right side.
Kenny had performed this stunt many times before, so what went wrong this time?
I got careless.
Kenny mops the sweat off his face before the stunt begins, but he forgets to wipe the right side.
When I leave my head in there, the sweat dropped on his tongue and he decided to bite me.
That single drop of sweat was enough to trigger the gator's massive jaws to snap shut. But even though he was nearly killed, Kenny doesn't blame the gator.
When you go messing with animals that are dangerous, that's what you get. You leave them alone, they leave you alone.
Kenny still wrestles alligators, but he doesn't try this stunt anymore.
Oh, I'd do it in a heartbeat, but I can't, I promised my wife and my kids I won't do that anymore.
A promise that his family hopes he keeps.
Okay, let me ask this question. Whose fault is this? I know you're sitting there saying Kenny, right? Because Kenny didn't fall over and his head accidentally rolled into the alligator's mouth. That's not how it worked. I mean, he purposely and deliberately put his head in the alligator. But whose fault is it? So this is a pretty good question, because what would you say if I told you that all Kenny was doing up to and until the time the alligator bit his head was what he does every single day, 3 or 4 times a day, and has done it every day for almost 20 years? This is the Gator Wrestling Show, and this is the big conclusion. This is how they all end, except in this case, it took a different turn. The most interesting thing about this is actually what I think this video can teach us, because I'm just going to say this, and please disagree. It's your chance. I would suggest Kenny is not much different
than every operation that you folks have. And I know that's hard and painful to hear, but let me explain my thinking and see if you agree. Now, the best way to have this conversation is maybe to not talk about Kenny, but let's talk about another event. So years ago, I was on a big investigation for a high explosive drop, and I get this phone call from another investigation that's just down the road from where we were, and they wanted to talk to me about some intricacies of this event. So what had happened is a train had crashed in California. The train ran for a company called Metrolink Rail, and it crashed in a place called Chatsworth, California. And two trains collided at 41.5 miles an hour. A Metrolink commuter train hit a Union Pacific freight train head on. And it killed 26 people immediately, and I think 2 additional people very soon thereafter. So 28 people died immediately, all of them on the commuter train. In fact, interestingly enough, nobody on the freight train was injured because the freight train knew there was a conflict and actually was stopping as aggressively as they can. But the commuter train did not even hit the brakes, and it smashed right into the freight train, and it was catastrophic. Now, I don't know if you remember this event. It was in the news a ton, so you probably will. But what happened is the driver of the commuter train was texting. He was sending a text message. And because he was texting, he wasn't driving the train. He wasn't paying attention to the train. And he missed a red signal, blew straight through the red signal, across the switch, and into the oncoming freight train. Now, here's my question. Is texting the reason that crash happened? Oh, let me ask it better. But I didn't ask it well for you guys. You folks are smart, so let me ask a different question. Is operator inattention due to texting? How's that sound? Is that better? Is that more comfortable? Is that the reason this crash happened? And the answer is, believe it or not, no. In fact, I'll say this before we go much further. I think you could replace texting, even though it sounds incredibly egregious. It was a bad thing to do. It's provocative. It was awful. And 28 people died, including the operator, the guy texting. Even though texting seems like it's super egregious, the bottom line is you could replace texting with anything, a heart attack, a full-blown burrito blowout. You know what that is? That's where you bite the top of the tortilla and everything kind of shoots out the bottom. You know what I'm talking about, right? A heart attack. I already said heart attack. A snake in the cab of the train. Anything that would have distracted the operator could have caused this outcome. And one of the interesting things about being a part of that conversation is their investigation really thought that texting was the problem. But in fact, I would suggest that's not the problem. The problem is really lack of control. So I did something kind of mean. When the Kenny video ended, I said, whose fault is this, right? Whose fault is this? Which totally directs you towards the people. And if you ask questions directed towards the people, then you're always going to get answers directed from the people. So the train is a really great example because initially texting makes you say, why on earth did that guy not stop at the red light? Why didn't he stop? Why was he texting, right? Why didn't he stop at the red light? But I would suggest that question is not that good of a question. The better question would be, is why on earth didn't the red light stop the train with an operator who was texting? And that difference is really behind me. Sidney Decker, my friend Sidney, says, to understand failure, the first thing we have to do is understand our reaction to failure. And let me tell you, anytime you put a worker in a position where the only control they have against failing, critical to safety, critical to quality, critical to production, critical to operations, critical to environment, you manage a ton of different criticalities. Anytime you put them in a position where the only control they have to getting better is they'll do it perfectly, that's actually called an operator-dependent safety system. That's a single point failure. And here's what I'm going to tell you. Any place where you have work that's done that is dependent on the operator doing it perfectly, you know what you're creating? Get ready, because I'm going to wrap a big bow around this discussion. You ready? Your very own alligator wrestling show. The reason the Kenny video is worth watching, the reason I show it to you, is because Kenny's in a classic operator-dependent system. Kenny's in a system where the only control he has against failure is he will do the job perfectly. And every single point failure you have, he says saying single twice, pretty impressed by that actually, that's knowable. And what that is, that's a place where the only control between the worker and the failure is the worker will be perfect. And you just can't live that way. And here's why. Think of it kind of like this. This is my picture of a sharp stick. I took this picture, right? So this is my work. At the pointiest end of the stick is the worker, the driver of the train, if you will. Behind them is the frontline supervisors, managers, leaders, the company, the customer, and at the far end is the regulator. Now, who's most likely to get injured on this stick? Well, the guy closest to the risk. Then that's no secret. We know that. That's why people who actually work with sharp stuff cut their hands, and people who manage people who work with sharp stuff hardly ever cut their hands, is access to the hazard, right? So what's amazing is that the threat, the injury potential always moves towards the sharp end of the stick. And yet, the power moves the other direction. You be as mad as you want to at that train driver for texting. I mean, he's dead, and it's never really that valuable to blame dead guys. But you can be. You have my permission. The one thing you can't blame him for, however, is the fact that he really had no control, no influence at all over some kind of engineered control, a light, a siren, one of those shocking dog collars, something that would not have allowed him to run a red light. And that's because the influence moves away. And this helps us build a case in human performance to sort of move our focus. So traditionally, every accident has three parts. There's the context. That's the squiggly line that looks like a maze. Then there's the consequence. That's where the two trains smash into each other. So that one's pretty easy. And then there's the retrospective way we look at the event after it happens. Context, consequence, retrospect. Traditional safety says what we manage is consequence. We have to stop the consequence. But here's what I'm going to tell you. The least interesting part of any accident is what happens, the consequence. You put two trains on the same track going in opposite directions, throw in a human operator, a single point failure, and a cell phone. Anybody shocked by what happened? I mean, it's pretty predictable, right? What's happening for you guys, and it's a big part of this journey, is we're moving from an old school model that said we reacted to consequence to a newer school model that says we respond to context. Because in context, the failure is happening. In context, it's already happened. In retrospect, don't even get me started on retrospect, because in retrospect, everything makes sense. Everything is on a timeline. The problem is that timeline didn't exist in the context. Because had it existed, I feel relatively certain that the train driver would have said, oh, I should stop texting because block 5 says die. And I'd like to stop before I get to the block that says die. So where do we take this? And how's this move us forward? Well, we want seductively unambiguous information about who screwed up. We want to know who did it. We want to hold them accountable. But let's do a little exercise. I don't know how well you can see this, but I took this picture a couple years ago in Atlanta, Georgia. This is not some exotic country, unless you consider Atlanta exotic, then it is. This is a van parked in front of a Quick Trip, my favorite convenience store, with 46 pallets on top of it. Now, the question I'd ask you is this a bad guy? And it's a good question, because I don't know how close you'd follow this guy on the road, but I'm thinking 47 pallets away. Give yourself sort of 1 pallet leeway when they fall. The crazy thing is I know nothing about this picture. I took it. I went out to talk to the guy because I wanted to ask him how tall he was, because it seems like he might have been pretty tall, and he wouldn't talk to me. In fact, he kind of drove away really fast. I'm pretty sure he thought nothing I had to say he wanted to hear. But what's amazing to me about this is, even though I know nothing about this, there's one thing I do know. And that is, this guy did not accidentally do this. And the reason I know he didn't accidentally do this is look at how incredibly effectively they're stacked on this van. This was hard to do, not easy to do. This is a challenge. This is substantive work. And I can tell you that of all the things I know, somehow, for some reason, this made sense to this worker. Because if it didn't make sense, he wouldn't do it. I mean, speaking entirely for me, and that is, I get bored stacking pallets at about number 2. I could no way get this done to 46. It just couldn't happen that way, right? For some reason, this made a difference. And I'm about to give you, I think, the tool that's the most impactful tool in shifting your philosophy around safety. And it's the one that had the biggest difference for us. And I'm glad to share it because it's so simple. Shift your thinking from who failed to what failed. The crazy thing is that who failed is going to take you down the trail of responsibility, blame, accountability. We know those words really well. But I'm not sure who failed is that terribly interesting. What failed makes a huge difference. Think of it this way. Who did this? Well, the answer is easy. What failed here? That's much different. And it's kind of the difference between asking how and why. Why is going to take you to some kind of personal responsibility. How drives you into that organizational context. And that's a really important part of where we want to go. Ultimately, where this goes is around this idea. I've said it before and I'll say it again. Workers are masters of doing work. If you want to know how work is done, who do you talk to? Not the leaders, not the designers, not the engineers, the people who do the work. They're experts in how work is done. But what they're really experts in is where your system is strong, effective, and robust, and where your system is brittle and weak and potentially breakable. And knowing that information means we have to stop seeing the worker as the problem and start seeing the worker as a solution. Now, I put this slide up here not to be preachy towards you, but to remind me that really the shift we're making in human and organizational performance is in how we view the workforce. Because the workforce is too rich of a resource, too good of a resource to not be understood and not be a part of our improvement strategy. Because I spend most of my time, I mean, even today, you heard me tell the story. I spend most of my time talking to leaders who want to tell me that their workforce made a bad choice. If I do an investigation, I promise you they'll get together and say, these guys made a bad choice. They were making bad choices. And here's what's interesting. The more I look at the case, the more I shift from who to what, the more I shift from why to how, what I realize is that it's almost never that workers are making bad choices, but it's almost always that workers are having bad choices. And that difference is pretty important to us. So where does this take us? Well, I was secretly thinking of this slide when we were talking about the car thing, but I didn't know how to jump ahead and get it, so I had to keep it here. You know what it's like to be safe when you drive. You also know what it's like to be dangerous when you drive. The problem is you're never 100% safe, because I don't think that exists, nor are you 100% danger. Where you are is in the middle, the gray area, the uncertain interpretation of when safe is safe enough. And what's amazing is that the lines that delineate safe from unsafe, those lines are constantly in motion until they're not. And what's remarkable is this is what an event looks like in consequence. But this is what an event looks like in context. And the difference between this and this is pretty powerful. Because this is easy to fix. Don't cross that line. Don't be this guy. Don't be stupid. Don't be dumb. But this requires a lot more discussion. This requires an understanding of the conditions that had to exist that allowed the failure to become successful. Ultimately, what we want to do is really try to align this idea that if risk is greater than control, you're in trouble. And so what we want to do is actually build a case where risk is equal to control. And we do that by really the last thing we're going to talk about today, and that's a quick cartoon for how we think about human performance. This white line, which oftentimes is called the black line, but I can't show a black line on a black slide because that's nothing. So the white line is actually representing the work as we imagine it, the work as we write the rules, the work as we write the regulations, the work as we write the practices, how we do the training, scoping, scheduling, how we buy equipment. This is work that the planners see that they send us out to do. So if that's what work looks like when we think about doing work, then what's this? Well, that is normal variability. That's normal work. And you'll see that we overperform systems and we underperform systems, and both things are relatively common. They happen all the time. What's interesting, and this is what I want you to think about, is that this represents the idea that what you manage is not the procedure. What you manage is the variability that normally happens around the procedure. And it becomes even more easy to illustrate if you actually think about Kenny the alligator wrestler. because his line goes down like that because he gets his head bit, right? And let's add one more line. Let's add this red line that represents the hazard. So if the red line hits the blue line, well, that's an accident. I mean, that's a failure. That's what failure looks like. We don't even have to talk about that because you're experts at understanding accidents. What we want to talk about, the fact is, traditionally, the organization has tried to fix safety by fixing this gap. Make workers be more obedient. Follow the dang plan. Follow the darn rules. Do what you're supposed to do. But I'd actually suggest this gap is kind of normal. It's normal operational variability. It's always present. It's the weather. It's the conditions. It's the people. They're always there. That gap is less interesting than this gap. That's the gap of capacity. That's the gap where we talk about the space between actual work and the actual hazard. That's where we put controls and barriers and safeguards. That is the margin of recoverability. And you know, when I say workers are the solution, what I'm really talking about is that blue line. Because what's amazing is every time there's an accident, there's a blue line. I know that because if we do an investigation, we try to aggressively and accurately and factually recreate the blue line as carefully as we can, right? But here's what I know. Every time there's not an accident, the blue line doesn't hit the red line, there's still a blue line. And so asking worker how work is done, that becomes really important because it's the only way to understand how much recoverability is in the system. So human performance uses these 5 principles. They're pretty simple. The first one is the idea that people aren't perfect. They make mistakes. That's normal. The second one is that blame fixes nothing. In fact, blame stops improvement. The third one is that if you want to get better as an organization, get better at learning about yourself. The fourth one, context drives behavior. Behavior is not an independent function of a worker making, I'm going to be good or I'm going to be bad. Behavior really is a part of the context in which we put the workforce in. So let me ask a question. Do you behave differently in a biker bar than you do at church? You're the same person, but my guess is the answer is probably yes. And last but not least, management response to failure matters. We've talked about that one a bunch. When we dig deeper into these human performance principles, this is what we're going to talk about. But for us today, the ultimate question is it worth it? Is the juice worth the squeeze? And the answer is, you bet. If we can identify the problem early, look at what we can control. Capacity is great. But if we wait for the problem to get big, look what we can't control. Capacity doesn't grow with the size of the problem. Ultimately, safety is not the absence of accidents. That's old thinking, and it's not that effective thinking. For us, safety is the presence of capacity. We don't want to create a system that tries to prevent all bad things from happening. We want to create a system that tries to ensure good things happen. We want to start when safe. And so now it's time to take a few questions. So I'm going to toss this out. I have no idea what's happening next, but I'm ready to talk to you about anything you want to talk about.
So my first question is it still raining? Is it raining? Oh, there.
We're told it stopped.
Yeah. How would you know? You guys are trapped in a conference room. I don't see a window for 1,000 miles around you guys.
Oh, we're told it is still raining. Yeah, no, we don't see outside right here.
I'm only asking that because in New Mexico we're jealous of all rain, so that works out well. So what did you guys think? What questions do you have? I wanted to do a quick overview and then leave enough time to really talk through some things that are potentially question points for you guys. So what reactions or comments do you have? So here's how I'll ask you questions like that, and then I'll look at you lovingly. That's what's going on there. Do you feel? No question. So let me guess a couple questions and tell me if I'm right on this, okay? we'll go that way because I bet you have some questions. One is, how do we align this coming from a long history, and I would say a successful history of behavioral-based safety? How do we actually then take these ideas and move forward? Well, if you remember the asymptotic curve, which I could pop back up, but I've already seen it, right? The asymptotic curve tells us that the process we're currently using is probably stagnant, which is relatively common. I mean, that's a part of how we think about what's going on and what's happening. The great thing is that we want to actually build a bridge from where we were to where we're going. So we don't want to take a flavor of the month approach. And I would highly encourage you from thinking of this as a big change. This is a philosophical shift in really the way operations thinks about leading reliable work is what's going on here. And so I would actually think about using the energy around behavioral-based safety and the fundamentals around behavioral-based safety, and over time, slowly and surely drift that away from worker observation to condition observation. Now, that's a really interesting transition. But what I would share with you is it's also going to be a really successful transition, because you can actually get the same people that are doing peer-to-peer evaluations in the field to focus really less on who they're watching and focus more on the context and conditions around them. And then what happens is you start to get a really interesting data set of where processes are strong and good, and that's always good data, and where processes may be a little brittle and a little bit, we can call them error likely or failure likely. And once you identify those, you're using the very best people in the world to identify that, the people who actually know and use the process on a daily basis. And you're actually gathering data that gives you as a leadership team better things to do, better ways to fix problems. Because instead of being asked to change behavior, because the bottom line is, and you've probably figured this out, we aren't really in charge of anyone's behavior. People are in charge of their own behavior. So instead of trying to change behavior, what we're actually changing are the conditions around the context, if you will, around the work, so that we have more reliable outcomes. Does that help? Is that a question that was on your mind that nobody wanted to ask?
Yes, I think it was.
Comments or pushback, anything?
There's a couple questions out here about one, you talked about safety being a lack of control. Can you speak a bit about detection of safety issues?
So let me ask a sort of a deep dive question on it. What do you mean by detection of safety issues? And there's no trick. That's not a loaded question. I'm genuinely interested. Are we talking about like potential conditions, goal conflicts, schedule conflicts?
Well, I'm reading Todd at Shelley. I'm reading these, but I'm wondering if maybe in light of this, maybe speak a bit about learning from successful work.
Okay, so that's a really good place to go with that. Because let's. So ultimately, I think the question is, what's happening when nothing bad is happening? That question is a really important question for you guys to kind of make your peace with, especially from an operations side of the house. So when no safety events, no quality events, when nothing bad is happening, the question you really want to dig into is, how come nothing bad is happening? What's going on when nothing bad's happening? The answer is that when nothing bad's happening, a lot of people are working really hard to ensure that nothing bad happens. Now, then, given that, the ability to actually go in there and understand normal work becomes much more interesting. Because generally speaking, what we've done, and I said this earlier, we've sort of waited for failure to happen to learn about the system. When in reality, what we want to do is probably understand what makes our processes and operations reliable, and then assure that those things that make our processes and operations reliable are actually in the system. And so in a way, you're sort of moving the calculus, and organizations are doing this all around the globe. We're moving the calculus away from stopping before we fail to starting when we're sure, starting when we're safe, starting when we're ready. Now, that actually lies into the initial question, which is, well, what do we do about safety issues? Well, so if workers are identifying potential hazards or conditions that could lead to failure, the very first thing we want to do is understand those in a much better level. So what I would actually recommend you guys do is when safety issues are identified, the very first thing I would do would be swarm together a group of workers really quickly and ask them to help you create the problem statement, because that's really key. In fact, I would suggest creating the problem statement is probably 99% of the battle. And then once they help you understand what the problem is, then actually ask them to help you generate solutions. And what I do at Los Alamos, and we've done this for years, is we actually ask the workers to generate 3 levels of solutions. We ask them to generate the quick and dirty. What's a quick and dirty way to fix this? You know, what's the let's say cheapest, but you know what I mean? The way that we can go in there, quickly mitigate this immediately. What's the near-term solution? And then what's the Cadillac? What's the long-term solution? And then what's interesting is that they help you understand and prioritize as a leader some path forward, but it's all contingent upon this ability to understand the problem in its full depth. So when people recognize safety issues, this process is weak, or there's a sharp here, or this is going to fail, what we want to do is kind of bring them in and talk to them about what happens. The very same process actually can apply to your near miss program. Do you guys have a pretty robust near miss program, or a close call, good catch? There's lots of names for them. Kind of depends on how you think about it. Do you have one now?
Yes, we do have the ability to report near misses.
So the cool thing about the near miss program is that what the near miss program allows you to do is ask a really, really, really effective leadership follow-up question. So when a person reports a near miss to you, the very first thing you want to do is thank them for reporting the near miss. That's a little obvious, but that's important, right? The very next thing you want to do is ask them, were we good or were we lucky? Now, the crazy thing about that question is no matter what they answer back to you, it's really good information for you as a leader. So if you say, you know, we had a near miss, this almost happened, you say, thank you for telling me that. Were we good or were we lucky? And they'll say, we were good. You actually have a process built into the system for that very problem. And when it happened, we were ready for it. We were able to identify it, and we were able to actually correct it before it had consequence. Well, so you just want to continue that as much as you can and really build that into your system. And if it's not formally there, then formalize it and think about it and build it into the process. That's good data. But let's say they come in and say we had a near miss, a pipe fell, it almost hit Fred on the head. Were we good or were we lucky? We were lucky. If Fred would have been standing 6 inches, you know, he would have been hit. Then that's also pretty good data too, because that tells you that you actually have a hazard out there that really did not have a control. And the control in this case was luck, but the control from forward on is actually going to be whatever mitigating factor solution you put in to actually solve that problem. The cool thing about good and lucky, and it really is this idea of failing good or failing lucky, is that it actually really changes the dialogue you have with the workforce. Because now you're really asking them a very interesting question they'll enjoy answering, and you're getting data from them in a way that engages them at a really much deeper level. You're starting to really lean on their expertise, and that makes a huge difference and actually is incredibly effective. How's that? What other questions do you have submitted?
I don't see any other questions, but I wonder if you can speak a little bit about blame, because that one is always a little hard to wrap your head around.
So blame is really interesting. I think that's a really good follow-up question. So the first thing I would tell you guys, because you're a pretty august body, I mean, my goodness, one of the conference rooms has the word world headquarters, so I feel very special to be talking to the world headquarters, is that what blame does most often is stop improvement. So let me say that again so it has a little anchor to it. Blame stops improvement. And the reason I say that to you is because as soon as we determine who failed, then there's really no longer any need to do further analysis to understand the failure. Because under sort of the rule in psychology, we call it fundamental attribution, but under the rule that that person did it wrong, that sort of gives us a complete story, and we can move forward thinking we should fix that person, never do that thing again. Now, the interesting part of blame is that blame actually is the opposite of learning. And the one thing that you guys are actually quite good at is the ability to understand operations and learn. I mean, that's something you've been working on for a long time, and it's an important part of sort of how you operate. If you think of blame as the counter theory to learning, then suddenly blame not only becomes sort of morally bad, which I would suggest there's a discussion we could have about why blame is a bad thing, but it also takes you away from the actual long-term sustainable improvement that is so vital to operations on a daily basis. The kicker is in order to understand blame, you really have to understand human error. And the important thing there is to remember that mistakes in retrospect always look like choices. So after something happens and the worker says they made a mistake, it looks like it was a choice. But in context, as operations are actually happening, mistakes are not choices. And so because mistakes are not choices, asking workers to not make mistakes is really not a very corrective action. It doesn't really make a difference. And so we have to understand that the first and most important thing you guys can do as a leadership team globally is to really think about this one phrase. We want to always default towards improvement. So when something happens, you have an operational upset or a safety upset, environmental upset, product quality upset. I mean, you have so many critical things that you guys manage. When something happens, as a leadership team, I would ask you to think about deliberately choosing to default towards learning. So the test you would give in the Department of Energy, we call it the ho-ho test. I have no idea why we call it the ho-ho test, but that's what they call it. But the ho-ho test you ask as a leadership team before you take action, the last question you ask before you put your strategy together is, does this move us towards improvement? Does it move us towards learning? And what's amazing about that is that little question, that little compass point that you're checking actually is incredibly helpful as a leader because it does give you a parameter by which to operate, but it's also incredibly valuable to the organization. But to do that, you have to let go of sort of the emotional need to blame the bad actor, the person who had the event. And sometimes that's hard, and culturally that's going to be kind of a journey. But once you get there, you'll never go back. I mean, I promise you'll just never go back. If you've raised kids or dogs, and there's a difference, but I don't know how much, we can talk about that later, you learn pretty early that blame is not a terribly valuable tool. Those same principles that we learn in parenthood apply themselves almost perfectly to the workplace environment as it relates to improving. Now, that doesn't mean discipline goes away. And in fact, as a leader, discipline becomes it's a relatively important tool. I would suggest discipline is not a terribly good safety tool, but it's probably a more effective performance tool. And one of the questions I'd ask, and I really do not know the answer to this, so I could be way off base and just correct me, is that oftentimes we convolute safety and performance management. And we'll use safety infractions oftentimes to solve performance issues. And that's relatively normal. And we could talk about why, but it happens a lot. I mean, it's relatively normal. That actually does two negative things to the organization. It actually makes your performance management system less effective, and it absolutely erodes your reliability and resilience program, your safety programs, your reliability program at a core and fundamental level. So part of the challenge is to realize that when we think about blame, we're sort of spending time, and our time's pretty valuable, doing things that don't really have a huge payoff for us. Because blame is not going to take us to improvement. It's going to take us to some kind of personnel action. Does that help? That might have been the longest answer to that question I could think.
So can you help us understand a little bit about learning teams?
Sure. So learning teams are so first of all, don't overthink what I'm about to say, and try not to make it too complicated, because it's not complicated. So what we learned at Los Alamos, and we've been doing these for a really, really long time, is that the very best people to understand an operational upset are the people who do the operations. And the origin story is my boss came to me one day and he said, I wish there was a way we could just bring a bunch of workers into a room and ask them to help us fix this problem. And I said, well, that doesn't seem too hard to me. I think we could probably do that. We got plenty of rooms, so it's not a space issue. Let's do it. And over time, we started to learn that when you engage workers in really two things, and I've talked about this just a moment ago, in problem identification and then in solution generation, what you get is a better understanding of the problem and a much more sustainable and, quite honestly, affordable solution. So anytime you have an operational curiosity, an upset, an interesting success, something doesn't go the way it's supposed to go, anytime you're sort of met with a problem and you think, I wonder what we should do, that's probably a pretty good indicator that you ought to bring together a group of workers, 4 or 5, maybe 6, but probably not many more than 6, and really ask them to actually do 2 little meetings. And oftentimes these meetings aren't more than an hour long, and ask them in the first meeting to help understand what happened. So generate the problem, and then have them take a break, come back for the second meeting and generate the solution. And the reason you actually do 2 meetings like that is because the first meeting, if you only do 1 meeting, the first meeting really is overtaken by solving the problem, and it eats up all the chance to understand the problem. So the biggest issue we have, and we probably all share this so we can collectively understand this is our problem, is that fixing is way more interesting than analyzing. And most of you guys, especially if you're ops people in the room, you pride yourself, you're actually really good at fixing problems. That's what you do. Which means you'll oftentimes fix problems that you haven't done reasonable analysis on. So the quick answer, and this is what we had to tackle, is we would fix the wrong things really well. Like we'd spend a lot of money fixing the wrong things, but we'd sure fix those wrong things very nicely. That wasn't necessarily a fixing problem. That was a input problem. And the reason we were having the input problem is because we weren't really looking at what the challenge of the work was. When you bring workers into the room, and remember you guys, expertise for operations lives at every level of every facility you have globally. When you bring the workers into the room and ask them to help you understand what the problem is and then generate the solution, you get better analysis almost immediately. But what you really get are better solutions. And between you and I, is anyone listening? Are we private? It's actually a better way to solve problems, and it's easier from a leadership standpoint. You get better solutions with less time and effort on the leadership side, because they're going to recommend some really good solutions. And almost always they're going to recommend things. Well, first of all, they're going to identify a problem you didn't know you have. I can guarantee that, because if you knew you had it, you'd have fixed it. So they're going to identify a problem that's actually going to be kind of a surprise to you. And then they're going to help you understand how to solve that problem in a very effective way. And what you'll see, especially with your people, is you'll see that they've already thought through these solutions because they work with this problem every single day. And they're kind of waiting for the opportunity to say, well, here's one idea I had. I was working in the GE appliance plant that makes dishwashers, which are incredibly complex to make. And they were having a problem with a gasket on the back wall of the dishwasher that they couldn't reach to install. And so they were actually, this will sound crazy, but they were actually actively recruiting employees with small hands to do this work, right? So, I mean, that's quite a remarkable thing I just said. It finally got to the point where this was a pretty big quality issue. It wasn't necessarily a safety issue, but it's a big quality issue. They put together a learning team, and in the first meeting, we did the problem identification, and we understood the problem pretty well. We came back for the second meeting, and one of the workers brought his lunchbox with him, which, if you haven't been able to discern from our time together today, gets extra credit with me. You bring food to a meeting, I like you almost immediately. And I thought, well, this guy brought his lunchbox. At a point in the meeting, he opened up his lunchbox and pulled a tool that he had designed years ago to actually install this gasket, and said, you know, I've thought this would work, but I can't get anybody to actually pay any attention. He brought the tool out. The team looked at it. They went out to the floor and tried it, came back and said, we'd like to actually recommend we try this tool. We'd like to do a little micro experiment with this tool. Management was blown away because this has been a problem they've had for years. And this tool, once they got it engineered and checked off, and they did all the things you need to do to have a tool on a plant floor like that, it actually solved the problem, and it's no longer a big issue. And the way I know it is because they no longer actively try to recruit employees with small hands. So that payoff on learning that way is actually a really powerful way to engage workers as experts, not as the problem. And that's part of the journey you guys are on, is that traditionally what we've done is we've seen the worker as the problem to be fixed. And I mean that in the nicest way I can. I know that sounds kind of blamey, but I don't mean it that way. But we've always thought the way we will make safety better is by making workers more safe. What we're learning, and there's incredible amounts of information and success stories all around the world in manufacturing, in the energy sector, in utilities, they're all on this journey you're on, is that in fact, improvement happens not when you ask the worker to be more obedient. Improvement happens when you put the worker in an environment where they can be more successful. And so that becomes ultimately the goal you want to really push for and understand. How is that?
Great. Does anyone have any other questions, or I can keep asking questions? So another thing, because this is a room full of primarily leaders in the organization, right. The last principle is how we respond to failure matters. So maybe you can speak a little bit about helping us as leaders to understand what that looks like and how we can support learning teams.
So there's two things that I would bring up. So between you and I, and no one else is listening, fine. I actually think that fifth principle, how leaders respond matters, is maybe the most important. Because the organizational culture is always influenced by the leadership. And the one thing I try to remember, and I have this written down on all my office, is when the leadership improves, the organization improves. Now, not saying that leadership is bad, but in fact, when leadership thinks differently and philosophically shifts, that means the organization comes along that journey with them. And so suddenly the questions you ask and the way you respond to off-normal events, or to near misses, close calls, good catches, or to interesting successes, to anything that sort of hits your desk, the way you respond is actually going to color everything that happens subsequent to that report. So I want you guys to chew on the fact that there's really 4 reasons workers don't tell you things. And there's a lot of things workers don't tell you. And those 4 reasons, let me see if I can remember them. I think I can. One is they don't realize the problem rises to the importance that you need to know. So they don't tell you because they don't think it matters. That's reason 1. Reason 2 is they've reported problems before in the past, and when they reported those problems, nothing happened. And so because nothing happens, they don't think there's a need to continue reporting because it doesn't seem to make a difference. The third reason people don't report is there's a potential that if they report it, they could get in trouble. And so if it's got a risk of getting you into trouble, then I'm probably not going to tell you what I need to tell you, because why would I tell you if it equates into me being in trouble? And the fourth reason, which I think is the most interesting reason workers don't tell you all that you need to know, is they're afraid if they do tell you, it's going to equate into more work. It's going to make their job harder, not easier. Now, remember those four things, and I can give you a copy of them if you didn't write them down or anything. I mean, they're not necessarily earth-shattering, but I think it's important for us to talk about. Remember those four things, because those four things are going to actually influence what you know as a leader. And I'm going to make a promise to you that if you know about problems earlier, then the problems are much easier and much more efficiently and effectively resolved. And so part of what we can do is help build a culture where you have earlier identification and earlier inclusion into problem solving so that you can actually help the organization improve quicker. But to do that, you have to build an environment where it's okay to tell you the truth. And how you respond to information is almost entirely the factors that make up that environment. So the big hint I would give you, and I gave it to you already, but it's probably worth saying twice, is the one experiment I'd like you to try, and just try this as an experiment. And if it sucks, stop. I mean, you don't have to continue doing it for sure. But the one experiment I'd like you to try is to really shift that question from who failed to what failed. And what's interesting is by asking what failed, you're sort of removing that potential conversation around blame and punishment, and you're moving them toward a much more healthy conversation around context and conditions. And once you get to that point where you're starting to ask what failed, and once you get there, again, you'll stay there because it's so much more effective. Then actually moving into a little learning team that you've swarmed together becomes kind of a natural response. It's not even difficult to do, because once they identify what the problem is, then actually now you've got a thing to go out and analyze and a thing to actually eventually come back and fix. The craziest thing between us is that I find starting the conversation with the system and then working towards the behavior, which is probably exactly opposite of how you've traditionally done it. Traditionally, we've been taught as leaders to start with the behavior and work towards the larger organizational system. That's kind of the way they taught us. But I would suggest that's probably backwards. That when you start with the system questions and then eventually, if you need to, get to the behavior, that's actually a much, much more effective and much more productive conversation with the workforce. And what it saves from a leader standpoint is it saves those awkward behavioral modification conversations, because most often when they talk about potential problems, once they identify system factors, then in fact, it becomes much more clear that this isn't really a behavioral issue. This is a much deeper organizational issue, and we need to fix the organizational problem as well.
And that ties in a little bit to incident investigation, where you advise to start with what normal work looks like as opposed to starting at the incident itself.
Yeah, so I don't know how you do an investigation of an event if you can't describe what normally happens. Like I wouldn't, and the rest of you safety people in the workshop today, I would sort of ask you the same question. I don't know how you could do an investigation if you don't know what normal looks like. So you really have to understand normal operations. And once you understand normal operations, then you can start looking at the event in a much deeper, much clearer, much more effective way. The key really, and this is going to be an important sort of evolutionary move for you guys, is the really the one thing you want to change almost immediately. Well, there's really three things you want to change immediately. And I would invite you to experiment with these. One is change your definition of safety. Safety isn't the absence of harm. It isn't. I mean, that's not what safety is. And because you're going to change your definition of safety, you're going to change what you measure and monitor, because you're going to monitor things like the assurance of patrols. You're going to make sure that the right things are there. The second thing you want to change almost immediately is the way you do investigations. You really want to look at investigations as a tool to provide really good analysis in order to generate corrective action. The key there is that investigations don't fix problems. Investigations learn. And when you do a really good job learning, then fixing becomes really obvious. And then the third thing is it's really, as a leadership team, deliberately choose to default towards improvement, deliberately choose to default towards learning. That makes a huge difference to what you do. What else?
I have a quick question. Is there a cap on some things? Like you mentioned that driving a fork truck inherently has fewer controls than, say, some other things, right? Do you feel like there's only so far you can get, right? Like with implementing controls, and yeah, it's maybe just more risky of a task?
So I actually think that's a really good question, because I think you can't engineer every hazard out of every system. And that to a great extent, we depend on expertise of workers to actually provide safe operations. And so I would say, yes, there's a cap. I don't know where it is. I mean, I haven't found it yet. But I would suggest that what really is important about this phrase of understanding sort of the absence of control is not necessarily putting more controls in the process. What's really important is that it changes the way, as a company, you guys think about risk. And what it'll do is give you a whole new set of targets to go out and actually assure. So instead of looking at high risk critical processes and trying to manage the risk part, what you want to do is look at high risk critical processes and try to manage the control part. And it's the relationship really between the words robust and resilient. So I always think of a dam. Did I say? I don't think I talked about this, but a dam has to be both a thing that holds back water. I'm not just cursing for the sake of cursing. Okay, I'm talking about a DAM, right? It has to hold back water, so it has to be robust, right? That's really important. But every dam, if there's enough water, will get to a point where they have to release some water on that dam. And to do that, they'll have all these secondary containment pools, spillways and canals and all these things. That's the resilient nature of a dam. Those two things must coexist simultaneously for a dam to be effective. The same is true in operations, is you have to have robust prevention of events. So you have to have robust hazard awareness, good training, good expertise, great people, good leadership. We can make that list a long time, while simultaneously having enough resilience in the system so that when you have a failure, you've got enough tolerance in the system that you can recover from that failure without significant consequence. So forklifts are really an interesting problem, because there's a great amount of people around the globe who spend nights and weekends thinking of ways to make forklifts safer. And they're doing it. It's a slow journey, but it's getting better and better and better. Part of that problem is because the forklift operations is such a complex operation. There are so many factors involved every time a worker jumps on a fork truck to do a job that it's hard to understand the relationship those complex things have with each other. And so we count on workers adaptively creating solutions, but we can absolutely do things like put in bumpers and cow catchers and things that move people away. Those are all really an important part of the discussion. With forklifts and with that risk question, I always think of cars and how they've worked progressively to make cars more and more safe. And it's the same thing. It's dependent on the operator because the driver is the most important part of vehicle safety, but the driver is also the least reliable part of vehicle safety. So they've built in reliability every place they can.
Thank you so much. I haven't seen any last minute questions pop up.
Would you say this is the best day ever? Didn't it feel like
I
the
would
best?
say this is the best day ever.
That's what I feel like. I feel like it too. I think we should just, here's my advice. You guys can all have the rest of the day off.
Well, thank you so much for your time. This has been incredibly valuable to get us thinking about all of this a little differently. Certainly been a good learning opportunity for all of us, and we just really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us today.
Good luck on the journey, you guys. I think you can do it. I think you'll be amazing. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone on the call. Bye-bye.